So this is a Reddit thread. Hey World of PP, I wanted to look at some of the data available on Solo Shuffle for WoW Arena logs. Shout out to Armsperson in a visual manner. I thought I'd share some of the outputs here for discussion / mild interest. I didn't really go into a huge amount of detail. This is some quick and dirty plotting, but I think some of them are quite interesting. I got a lot of the data from the aforementioned WoW Arena logs Solo Shuffle spec performance report, filtering on matches played above 2100. I figured above this rating, most people know how to play their class, or at the very least know how to output damage and healing. So it's a truer representation of the specs. To my knowledge, players using the app will automatically upload their combat logs to the website, which allows it to collect and summarize some interesting stats. Match played, win percentage, average DPS, average HPS, burst DPS, and first blood. Burst versus sustain damage, is it a trade-off? First, I want to check out if specs with high burst have to sacrifice some sustain. Okay. So let's look at this. So here is the chart. So burst DPS. So this left axis is burst DPS. So whoever is the highest on that does the most burst. And this is average DPS. So average DPS all the way on the right. So it looks like the highest overall burst and sustain is Affliction Warlock, Frost Decay, and Devastation Evokers. The absolute lowest burst and lowest sustain is Sub Rogue. That seems a bit weird. Arcane Mage is also bad. Asa Rogue, Fire Mage. That's very interesting. So it's a kind of, I wouldn't say it's misleading, but you have Demo, Shadow Priest, Survival BM, Asa, Fire Outlaw. It's a bit misleading because basically what it's showing is like in the bottom left-hand quadrant, that is low burst and low sustain. But I mean, you have specs like Demo in there, so that doesn't really make sense. So a big problem is I think both Demonology Warlock and BM Hunter are not showing up right on the logs, or they would be way higher for both, I think. Because the logs normally don't show pet damage, so that's a huge problem, yeah. This chart is a little bit weird, but interesting nonetheless. Surprisingly, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. Often specs with high burst also get to do a lot of DPS and downtime as well. My theory here is that burst damage is so high for some specs, example Ret and Devastation, and can happen so often that it skews their overall average DPS as the primary driver behind this apparent correlation. At the same time, Arcane Mage, for example, feels like it does a lot of burst when played correctly, but it's still not enough to push it into the top quadrants. Specs like Frost Decay and Affliction will also be padding a lot on damage and pets, blah, 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 blah. Feral and Unholy have low burst and high sustain, and Marks having the reverse makes sense to me. Ideally, all specs should either be in the top left or bottom right quadrant, or on a curve crossing those two. Although admittedly, this doesn't take into account things such as CC, utility, survivability on top of the potentially skewed I mentioned above. This plot may suggest that Affliction Lock and Devastation Evokers are the best specs, which we all know is not the case. Damage versus healing. Who has more throughput? An interesting picture starts to emerge once we look at healing and damage of DPS specs. So now you have average HPS with average DPS. So you want to be in that, you want to have the highest damage and the most healing. And Affliction Warlock is all the way at the top, even though it's one of the worst specs. Is that funny? And you have Enhancement Shamans. That's why when people are like, oh, look at the logs, like people who are just obsessed with damage meters, this is a perfect example of Affliction Warlock doing lots of damage and lots of healing, and it sucks, which is very interesting. Enhancement Shaman's up there. Somehow Destro Warlock is up there. I'm surprised Destro Warlock has so much HPS. I'm a bit surprised about that. Affliction Warlock comes up top again with very high sustained damage and highest HPS per match, which makes sense with Dark Pack, Hellstone, Drain Life, Live Lording they need to do in order to not flop. Enhancement Shamans come out second for presumably similar reasons, spending a fair amount of downtime casting healing surges on themselves and their teammate. Interestingly, despite a general consensus that pure DPS specs do too much healing, all the Rogue Mage Hunter specs fall into the bottom left corner, not doing much healing or damage. Of course, we know that a lot of power on these specs comes from CC and burst damage at the right time. Shadow Priest's position makes sense on the plot, as it generally considered a low damage but high burst support spec. Using shields and life swaps, conversely, Feral is the bottom right quadrant, which is in line with the perception that nowadays Ferals are more of a PvE DPS bot rather than making use of the hybrid capabilities. True. Here again, an ideal shape might be specs lying on a curve, going from top left to bottom right, sacrificing healing support for damage, with Hybrids being closer to the top left and Pure being closer to the bottom right. But then again, we're not accounting for burst CC, survivability, mobility. We'll include these healers in these spots, take away from the intuition we can gain at first glance. Just so I don't completely ignore them in the post, here the same graph using healers only, which makes slightly more sense to me. Interesting. So then you have average DPS. Holy Priest has the worst damage, then Paladin, Shaman. You have Punch Monks and Disc, and the highest healing with most damage is Evoker. Makes sense. Look at Holy Priest damage. This is just trash, dude. That's crazy. The classic trade-off between Holy and Disc is visible here. Disc having the lowest healing output, but one of the highest healing outputs, damage outputs, and Holy being the reverse, except for their comparatively shit HPS. Provoker's HPS being the highest makes sense, but I think their relatively high DPS is skewed by the very high burst they can do every now and then. Mistweaver is interesting, but expected, as both Caster Mistweaver and Fistweaver will be included. Shaman's positioning baffles me here, though. Yeah, that is weird. Restorator has the exact same DPS and HPS in this dataset as Holy Priest, so imagine a tiny glowing leaf icon where the Spirit Healer is. I think it's also worth calling out at this point that data represents the whole season, which is why Shaman and Disc might be lower than where they are. So while we're losing some of the nuance of tuning cycles, we get a feel for where balancing is aimed at over a large period of time. Success versus DPS is damage king. Finally, because an often repeated advice here is just do damage. I was interested in seeing if the data backs it up. Okay, so success versus damage in solo shuffle. Win rate percentage versus average DPS. So, okay. So you have classes like Evoker and Affliction Warlock that do the highest damage but the lowest win rate. The best win rate in the entire game is Rep Paladins, followed by Demo Warlocks. I don't know what that is. Is that Frosty K? What is that? Is that Windwalker? Okay, that's Windwalker. So you have Ret, Demo, Windwalker. Outlaw has a very high win rate, which is very surprising. The lowest win rate is Sub. Look at Sub Rogue. What? Like Arcane Mage has a really low win rate. Oh, average DPS. Sorry, they have a low win rate. Yeah, so this is over the entire season, guys. And then you have that's interesting. So yeah, win rate is okay, so the worst win rate is Sub Rogue, then Devastation, then Affliction, then Unholy, then Destro, then Arcane, then Survival, Demon Hunter, Frosty K, Marks Hunter, Feral, Asa, Shadow Priest, Ellie, Fury, Boomkin Warrior, and then on the highest win rates are Fire Mage, Frost Mage, BM, Enhance, Windwalker, Rep Paladin, Demo, and Outlaw Rogue, which is very interesting. You wouldn't expect certain specs, like I wouldn't expect Fire Mage to have a high win rate, and you wouldn't expect Outlaw Rogue to have a high win rate. And that's the thing, right? With certain specs, I think like Fire and Outlaw are a bit weird because not that many people play them. It's a really small sample size. All right, so interesting. In most case, in the case of Rep Paladin and Sub Rogues, it seems so. However, for specs like Affliction and Devoker, damage alone isn't enough to win games. Most of the time, Outlaw, whose sample size will be lower. Two of the Mage specs and BM Hunters can do more than they lose, despite doing less damage than the average. Perhaps a more accurate view, given the data we have, is given by counterbalancing the damage classes due to survivability, percentage of the games that are killed first. All right, so this is win rate versus average DPS slash first blood rate. Average DPS slash first blood rate. That's interesting to kind of mix those together. And then your win rate. So it turns out that having the highest damage and the highest survivability makes it so you win a lot. And once again, this whole thing is a bit scuffed because Demo and BM Hunter should have way higher damage. Way higher damage. So Sub Rogue, low damage, low survivability, loses a lot. And then you have Devastation Evoker, which also dies often. Affliction Warlock, which dies often. Unholy Death Knight, which dies often. Destro, Arcane, Havoc Demon Hunter. And then some of the tankier classes are... What's behind Fire Mage? What is that? Frost Mage? Frost and Fire almost have identical stats. That's interesting. Very interesting. But yeah, not dying and doing a lot of damage. That was actually a quote from Swapsy. Like, what's the game-winning strategy in World of Warcraft? Do damage, don't die. That's Swapsy. That's like a quote from Swapsy. His outlook on the game. What's the best way to win? Do damage, don't die. Do damage, don't die. There you go. This start gives more sensible output, except for Rats and Rogues. Devoker and Affliction move closer to the bottom left, and Handsome Shamans move to the left as well. All specs like Havoc and Unholy take Affliction's place from before. As a side note, I'm not sure we can comment on what ideal shape of this plot would be. Perhaps one where all the specs broadly on the 50% horizon line, but spread out across it. Different specs should have a variety of win conditions beyond damage that were not accounted for here, and arguably complete balance would be achieved by each spec having broadly 50% chance of winning against each spec over a large enough sample. Conclusion. I don't know. We looked at some plots. Some commentary conclusions can be made from them, and obvious offenders, Ret and Subrogue, can be pinpointed. The damage is perhaps too exaggerated, taken over long periods of time. It doesn't account for several factors to really dive into. Some things I'd like to look at and quantify would be damage outside of burst windows. This would give a more accurate representation of specs downtime DPS. CC done. Utility, this is hard to quantify, sometimes less tangible, but could have a go counting the numbers in life grips cast or something. There are many limitations to this. I've touched on some of them throughout the text, but I won't list them. I'm not submitting this to be some peer-reviewed journal. Just for laughs, have a plot showing the win percent versus the number of matches played of each spec. Win percentage versus the number of matches. Success versus number of matches in solo shuffle. Damn, it's crazy, man. Like, Rogue and Mage just isn't played very much, aside from Frost Mage. I didn't even see Ret over there. I didn't actually see Ret. I was like, damn, Demo's the best. Okay, that's fucking crazy. And then look at Ret. Holy shit, man. This guy's on a different planet. I don't really have anything to say about that. You guys can draw your own conclusions from the data, but that's all we'll have to say there. There's some good stuff though, man. It's cool to look at this stuff. Big shout out to your P-Meister, ARP Meister, Art Meister. Thank you very much, man. And Arms Person and WoW Arena Logs. This is it's cool to look at this kind of data. Doesn't tell the full story, but in some cases it definitely does, right?